Good afternoon, class, and yes, happy Friday to everyone. This is MAE 106, Discrete Mathematics with Probability. My name is Richard Kohar, and this is lecture 11, More Arguments. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay and that the video quality is smooth and the audio is okay. Again, I assume that there's a little bit of a lag. Excellent. Hello. Okay. So in previous lectures, we were able to demonstrate if an argument was valid or invalid. However, there can be valid arguments that use false propositions. And here's one from ancient times. This is due to St. Augustine of Hippo. And let's just kind of recall, first of all, what Modus tollens was. We said that Modus tollens was that we had an implication if P then Q. The second premise was that if it's not Q, therefore not P. Well, what Augustine, circa 350 to about 430. What he had shown was, this was his example. He said, if a snail is an animal, it has a voice. Okay? A snail does not have a voice. So therefore, a snail is not an animal. Okay, so this is clearly false, right? A snail is an animal. So what is the problem that we have with this? Okay, well, if we look at this argument, we'll say a snail is an animal. We'll say that this is P. We'll say it has a voice, is Q. So our premise here is P implies Q. A snail does not have a voice. So we'll say it's not Q. Therefore, a snail is not an animal. So we'll take the negation of P. So there we have it. This is our symbolic form of the argument. We have P implies Q, the second premise, or the minor premise, not Q, therefore not P. But, you know, you'd be saying, wait a minute. This is Modus tollens. Isn't this supposed to be a valid argument? And yield true conclusions. Yes. Modus tollens is a valid argument. We had proven this. Yes, a valid argument will yield true conclusions, But remember, it's whenever all the premises are true. Okay? So one of these propositions, or the premises, must not be true. A snail doesn't have a voice. It's possible that it doesn't have one, so we could maybe assign that this is false. Or we could say that this implication, if a snail is an animal, it has a voice, that this proposition might not be true as well. In either case, one of these propositions is false because we are using an argument that should generate true conclusions, and that's only if the premises are true. When we have a valid argument and we get a conclusion that we know is false, and we reasoned with a valid argument, we then think that one of our premises must be true. So, what is this all about is that your inferences are only as good as your premises. So you can reason all you want using valid arguments, but if your premises are not true, you cannot be guaranteeing what the conclusion should be, the truth of it. So we're beginning to see that there can be invalid deductions from true statements, just as there are valid arguments from false propositions. So what we'll do is we will drive home this point with a definition. Truth and falsity. Okay? These are attributes or properties of propositions. Okay? This is, I know this may seem trivial, but again, we defined a proposition as being either true or false, but not both, right? And we'll define validity and invalidity. These are attributes of the arguments. Okay? So again, you can be looking at over here as P, Q, R. These are propositions. And over here, let's color in something like this. And maybe I'll color it with this. So over here, these are true or false. And over here, these are arguments. And this is valid or invalid. So arguments are valid or invalid solely based on the structure of it. And the propositions are based on whether they're true or false. Okay? Why are we so concerned about this is there's a term that people throw around very loosely. And this is the idea of a sound argument. You may hear people say, oh, this is sound reasoning, this is a sound argument. What we have a very specific definition in math what a sound argument is. What a sound argument is that all premises are true. The argument is valid. And from those two things, you are guaranteed a true conclusion. So, going back to St. Augustine's snail has a voice argument, this is a valid argument, but it is not sound. Okay. So we looked at what a valid argument was, that if a valid argument has all true premises, then that is called a sound argument. So what happens if we have a valid argument but false premises? Then again, we can't be sure of the conclusion. Let's look at a historical example. Here's number 3. And this is from the textbook. Okay, so this is from around 1858. And this is from American history. It's about the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. And he was in one of his debates with Stephen A. Douglas. He was a senator from Illinois at the time. And they were arguing over slavery. And they were specifically talking about the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was an African slave who had attempted to sue for freedom. And the Supreme Court of the United States, in a landmark decision in 1857, decided against him. And it was one of the reasons that precipitated the American Civil War. And here is where you have Lincoln. He is arguing against Douglas. Arguing against Douglas. And this is what he says. He says, I think it follows from the Dred Scott decision and submit to the consideration of men capable of arguing whether, as I state it in syllogistic form, the argument has any fault in it. Okay? So he starts off with taking his opponent's argument and breaking it down into a syllogism. The first premise, or the major premise, he says, nothing in the Constitution or laws of any state can destroy a right distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution of the United States. Okay. The second premise, or the minor premise, something a little bit more specific. The right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution of the United States. So therefore, the conclusion is, nothing in the Constitution or laws of any state can destroy the right of property in a slave. Lincoln further continues with, I believe that no fault can be pointed out in that argument. Again, he's talking about the structure of the argument. Assuming the truth of the premises, the conclusion, so far as I have capacity at all to understand it, follows inevitably. There is a fault in it, as I think, but the fault is not in the reasoning, but in the falsehood, in the fact of the premises. I believe that the right of property in a slave is not distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution, and Judge Douglas thinks it is. I believe the Supreme Court and the advocates of that decision, of the Dred Scott decision, may search in vain in the place in the Constitution where the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed. I therefore say that I think one of the premises is not true, in fact. So what Lincoln was saying was something along the lines of, like, if we think about it in terms of a syllogism, let's say if a right is in the Constitution, then you cannot destroy the right. Okay. Then he says, slavery is a right in the Constitution. Okay. So what I've said here is that Q is a right. R is a right, and we'll say that R here is you cannot destroy it, and we'll say here's P. So there is the slavery, it's a right, it's in the Constitution, you cannot destroy it. And then we'll finish off with therefore, P implies R, which means that P is the slavery. Slavery is a right that you cannot destroy. Okay, so what Lincoln was saying, again, was he did not find any fault in this, in the reasoning, right? Because Q implies R, P implies Q, therefore P implies R. Well, again, if you rearrange that as P implies Q, Q implies R, therefore P implies R, that's a hypothetical syllogism. And we had proven that this is valid. So this is a valid argument. However, what Lincoln was saying was that the falsehood is in fact in the premises. And what Lincoln was saying was that this is true. However, he says if you search in vain in the Constitution, you will not find that slavery is a right. So what Lincoln had said then was that this was false, that the second premise was false. And therefore, just because you were reasoning with a valid argument does not mean that you can then conclude with certainty that the conclusion is true. So, what did Lincoln end up saying? Essentially, he says it's a valid argument, but it is not a sound argument. Is everyone okay with that so far? Okay, perfect. Just a little confused, but I'm good. All right. So again, it's just kind of reinforcing that original statement, which we said, which your inferences are only as good as your premises. So your conclusion is true, provided that your premises and your argument is valid. So, okay. So we had done soundness. So hopefully now people around you, when they start to throw around terms from logic, like, oh, I'm making a very valid point, sounds a bit odd to me. You can say a point or a premise is true or false, but I'm not sure about whether or not that's valid. Or when somebody says that this is sound, that's quite a bold statement. You're saying that both your premises that you're using and your argument is valid, and you're asserting that the conclusion then is true. Okay. Not sound because the premises are false. That's right. Yes. So for a premise to be, for a sound argument, all the premises must be true. The argument is valid, and so then you're guaranteed a true conclusion. If one of these conditions fails, then it's not sound. Okay, so I hope that answers that question. Okay, so this is a question from an old exam. This one says, determine the validity of the following argument. So to do this, what we need to do is represent this symbolically, which means that I should define my propositions. So let's say that P means that Hal is a politician. Oops, not Hall. Hal is a politician. We'll say that that Hal is a lawyer. And we'll say that R, he is a fraud. Okay. So over here are my define the propositions. So that's kind of the first step. The second step, represent the argument symbolically. So over here I have an if. So I have if, and then I have a then. Oh, and then I have an or. Okay, so the way that I would parse this here, I see if Hal is a politician, then he is a lawyer or a fraud. Okay, so I will say for the first premise, if Hal is a politician, so P implies, so if P, then he's a lawyer, which is Q, or he's a fraud. I'm also using the disjunction, just the regular disjunction. I'm not using the exclusive disjunction. So I'm going to allow that he could be both a lawyer and a fraud. So that's the first premise. The second premise is that he is a lawyer. So that's just Q. He is not a fraud, so we'll write R. But because I have the negation not, I'll put not R. And then they give us the conclusion, Hal is not a politician, so not P. So is this a valid argument? Well, the next step for this one would be a truth table. And we'll do it one way. So let's do, we write out our propositions. So we have our prime propositions with PQR. Then our next premise, let's build this up. Let's do Q or R. Then we'll do P implies Q or R. Then I'm going to rewrite out Q. Let's write not R, not P. So let me just write this over here. These are our premises. Over here is our conclusion. Okay. So I have 3 prime propositions, which means that I'm going to have 8 lines. And then I'm going to do my OR on the Q and or R. So I'll just kind of cover this up. So this, at least one of them has to be true for this to be true. So okay. Is that what everyone got for their truth table so far? then cover up this. All right, then I'm going to do the implication going from this column to this column. So true implies true, that's true. True implies true, that's true. True. This is false. True. 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 And true. Okay, and hopefully everyone got the same one as this. While people check that, I'm just going to copy out my Q column again. I mean, I suppose you could be looking over at this column. You didn't have to rewrite this, but just for simplicity, when we look at the premises here, I can just look across these 4 columns altogether. And then I just flip this. Okay, not P. Okay, so there. So I pull out a highlighter, and there's mine. Let's have a look. So I'm looking for the lines where I have all true premises. So this is not one. Here it is. I have 3 truths, and I have then the conclusion is false. So just based on that, I don't have to continue any further. I mean, you do notice here that you have a line here where there's 3 truths and then the conclusion is true. But it fails to have a true conclusion when you had all the premises are true. So since it failed, therefore, the argument is invalid. So, something that somebody might ask, so here's a question. If the conclusion is true and all the premises are true, then does that mean the argument is valid? So what do you think in the chat? If the conclusion is true and all the premises are true, does that mean that the argument is valid? Did we not just show it wasn't? Well, what we had shown was that, in this case, this was an invalid argument. But let's say that I had so in the previous one we just showed that it was invalid. So the question was saying that you had true premises. So you had a true premise, you had a true premise here. Therefore, and you had another true conclusion. Is this a valid argument but may not be sound? That's right, it could be a valid argument. It could also be an invalid argument. Is this necessarily true? Or is this necessarily Well, what I can do is I can show you, I would agree. Okay, so you have a true premise, and a true conclusion. Is this necessarily valid? Okay, well, what I can do is, going back to this previous example here, determine the validity of the argument. You could have the case like this, where you have a true premise, and a true conclusion. Okay? And here is your case right here. You can have it where here's the first premise is true, the second premise is true, the third premise is true, and you have a conclusion here that's true. It's quite possible to have this. But this is still an invalid argument because we found a case where we did have all the true premises and there is a false conclusion. So the answer to this is no. Just because you have a true premise and a true premise here, just like in this case. Okay, perfect. Yeah, didn't we just show that it wasn't exactly? I see where you're going. So I'll just kind of put this in color here. So look at the previous page. At star and double star. So this is the case right here where I have a true conclusion and true premises, but right here is the case where it makes it invalid. And again, it goes back to this distinction that we made, because people make that confusion all the time when they keep saying, "Oh, true propositions means that it's a valid argument," and no. Again, the attributes of propositions are truth and falsity, and the attributes of arguments is validity and invalidity. These two things don't necessarily affect each other. These do affect each other when we start to talk about a sound argument. And again, I'll just go back to what a sound argument was. That's where it combines those two ideas together. This idea of truth and validity, by combining those two together, where all the premises are true and the argument is valid, then you're guaranteed a true conclusion. That is what we call sound. Two, three, here we go, 4. And here's the last argument that we'll look at for today. Okay, so again, kind of those 3 steps. Define your propositions. So I study math. So let's say P is I study math. Q is I study economics. And the other one I see is I have to take English. Okay, so those are our propositions. So symbolically, I have an or here. So the first premise is going to be I study math, so that's P, or economics is Q. The next premise is if I have to take English, so I have an if here and then, so I know that this is an implication. If I have to take English, so if I take R, this implies that I study economics, so that's Q. Okay. I study math, P. Therefore, I do not have to take English, so not R. And there's a question up in the chat. If that is the case, and an argument is only valid where every premise, conclusion, group is true, is every... Okay, so just being... I gotta be... So let's no, a valid argument, you can does that make sense? A valid argument only, if I go back to this one, so this is invalid. And a valid argument only says that if you give it true premises, like in this case, if you give it true premises, it will guarantee a true conclusion. That's all that it says for a valid argument. For it to be sound, what you're telling me is that you are telling me that for sure all the premises are true. So if you tell me, again, So the argument is valid. So that one will say whenever the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. All the premises are true, so then it follows from the valid argument that you are guaranteed a true conclusion. Does that answer the question? Is it possible to see an example of a sound argument then? Yes. The conclusion is true whenever all premises are true. This one would say, so this is a valid argument is when will guarantee that the conclusion is true whenever all the premises are true. You tell me that all the premises are true, therefore you have a true conclusion. So the one example of a sound argument. We have 2 minutes. Okay. This is a very basic one. Okay. A cat is a mammal. We'll say P implies Q. So this is P. Over here is Q. Right here is a mammal. So we'll say Q is an animal. So we'll say R. So Q implies R. Therefore, a cat is an animal. So we'll say that this is P implies R. And this is a hypothetical syllogism. Okay. We know, first of all, from here, these are true premises. So that's number one. Number two, we know that the hypothetical syllogism is a valid argument. So we have 1 and 2. So from these, we are guaranteed the conclusion is true. And since you are using true premises and a valid argument, This is a sound argument. Right? Because these are true premises right here. Okay. So I hope that answers that question. That was an example of a sound argument. And for this one, you would just have to complete the truth table for this. So I hope I answered the question that's in the chat. And you would do a truth table for this as well, and you find that this is invalid. Okay. If there's not any more questions, we'll wrap this up. Please feel free to send me an email at my RMC account. There's office hours tonight, later at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And have a look. Okay, I'm going to do a truth table to visualize. Perfect. And again, if you have further questions, feel free to drop by tonight. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope you have a great evening and the rest of the weekend. I will see you on Tuesday. Take care.